And we are recording. I am Giulio Prisco. I'm here in conversation with Frank Tipler, who is one of the scientists or philosophers or thinkers, public intellectuals, who had a very deep influence upon me. I started reading his book more than almost 30 years ago now. And I had the pleasure to discuss with him many times over the year. So in this conversation, I'd like to touch base with Frank and discuss some interesting things that I have in mind. Thank you very much, Frank, for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So I've seen this very interesting recent interview with John Horgan titled "Is the Omega Point Ironic Science?", which is the expression that he uses in his book, The End of Science. Now, since we have discussed these things many times, I'm not going to ask you to explain to me what the omega point theory is, because you have explained it to me already many times. I hope I have understood. And even besides the verbal explanation, you have written about these things in a way that is crystal clear in your books. I wanted to mention something that you discuss in the interview, which is the fact that somehow these artificial super intelligences that you have written about, they seem on their way. And it may happen that one of these days, perhaps not too far in the future, we will have a very big surprise embodied by super artificial intelligences that can think like a person or better, and that are conscious like a person. In fact, I found very interesting the fact that a few months ago, the Nobel Prize in Physics 2024 went to foundational discoveries in artificial intelligence. And just one day after that, there was the announcement of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, which went to some of the more striking applications of modern artificial intelligence technology to things like protein design and eventually the future of the possible future of medicine. Now, what do you think? Are we about to see conscious artificial intelligences like persons, and how likely is it that they will evolve to artificial super intelligences sometime soon?
Well, what I have been arguing is that the technology to create a artificial intelligence beyond that of a human already exists in our supercomputers. And I was arguing that what we need is the technology to create human level intelligence to be in laptops. Then you'll have the possibility of actually creating such things. Now, we passed the laptop criteria several years ago. I tell my students that in terms of information processing ability, your smartphone is smarter than you are. What the smartphone lacks, of course, is the programming. So once you've got the basic technology, the programming should follow fairly soon. Now, fairly soon is somewhat ambiguous. I predicted that we should see these human level artificial intelligences in programming power actually appear by 2030, which is only 5 years away. Now, am I right? I really don't know. This is just my estimate on what human beings can do. I can prove, however, that these artificial intelligences must arrive within 10 billion years. Now, that's not a very useful upper bound from human standpoint. To put it in perspective, typical mammalian species will exist for around 10 million years before being replaced by some other species. We've been around for 200,000 years, we Homo sapiens. So maybe we've got another 9+ billion years to go. But eventually, on universal scales, we will eventually be replaced. And the replacement with higher level intelligence won't stop there. These higher level intelligences will similarly be replaced. Now, we humans are obviously more advanced in terms of our information processing ability than one-cell organisms, amoebas. But an amoeba is a eukaryote, and they are more advanced than prokaryotes. So over the 3.5 billion years that life has existed on Earth, information processing ability has increased enormously. So looking at the future of the universe, which is measured at least in trillions rather than mere billions of years, we expect this information processing ability to really increase. Now, in my articles and so forth, what I've done is prove that the laws of physics are going to require eventually artificial intelligence, superhuman intelligence, to take over the universe and gain control of it and guide it into its final state. They have to do this in order to survive. I've written a book on this, explaining in detail why it has to occur this way, the physics of immortality. And what I've been doing since that book appeared in 1994 is amplifying the argument which appeared in that book and trying to get additional evidence to support it. I can now prove, using the laws of physics, that the overall picture that I describe in that book actually follows directly from the laws of physics that are known to us today. So that's one of the arguments I used against Horgan. He was arguing that this omega point theory is not really science. On the contrary, it follows from the laws of physics that are in the textbooks. So you have to believe, unless you have an experiment showing otherwise, in the laws of physics in the textbooks. They're in the textbooks for a good reason. They're in the textbooks because they have been confirmed over many years by experiments, and we have never found an exception to it. We may. Who knows? Maybe the laws of physics will go out of power next week and something else entirely. Laws of physics tell me that can't occur, and it's never occurred as far as we've been able to tell. So I think the evidence is overwhelming against that. So we have to trust the laws of physics. If we do, we have to believe eventually the universe will be taken over by superintelligence.
You think about the laws of physics, whether we are already close to knowing the ultimate laws of physics is indeed one of the points that I want to get back to eventually. But let's stay with the current world of artificial intelligence technology for a while. Now, you say this thing, okay, these things should achieve human level intelligence in a laptop, or maybe even more to the point, in a robotic body that looks like a human body in terms at least of size. Now, I believe that kind of thing is going to happen one day, but we are not, we don't seem to be close to that point yet, because at this moment, the physical embodiment of the more advanced artificial intelligences is more like a huge data center than a laptop. They are huge distributed supercomputers that fill a building, which do look like this old concept of huge electronic brains of golden age science fiction. And it seems there is a huge miniaturization effort that will have to be done to create artificial intelligences that are self-contained in a form of embodiment that is more or less equivalent to a human being. Now, you mentioned that this is a software problem. Do you think it's only a software problem, or perhaps we still have to develop much better computational substrates based on physics that is not the physics we use to build computers at this moment?
No, I think that if you estimate the speed and capacity of the neurons in the human brain, we know how many neurons they are, and roughly we know their ability to, the amount of information that they can code. We can compare that to the information processing rate on any computer and the memory storage in the computer. And those numbers for the human brain are comparable to the numbers of information processing rate and memory storage in a laptop. So in this sense, we already have enough power. Now, comparing supercomputers with laptops, you have to do that at each stage of human history. When I went to MIT as a freshman, and that was quite a while ago, as you can see from my white hair, um, MIT was so proud because they just got the latest supercomputer from IBM. And current cost, it was something like $200 million. And IBM basically gave it to MIT because MIT couldn't afford $200 million. The information processing ability and the memory storage of that supercomputer of 1965 is insignificant compared to any computer available for sale today. Any laptop is gigantically more powerful than that machine. That was the supercomputer of the day. Now, in my book, Physics of Immortality, I point out that typically laptops, desktop computers, follow supercomputing power by about 20 years. So the supercomputers of today, if that continues, should be available in laptops in about 20 years' time. I'm just projecting what's been true in the past into the future. Now, this is not physics. This is human technology, which involves a heck of a lot more than just physics. So I'm far less certain of that prediction than I am about the prediction of supercomputers taking over the universe, which is just standard physics. But the point is, I agree with you in one sense about technology that what we need to do is combine the computers with a robotic body so the computers can actually interact with the physical world. If you look how children learn to think, they're not born capable of language. If you have children, you've watched your children grow and figure out how to use language and associate words with things that actually are there in the physical universe. They are interacting with the universe, playing with it, crawling around with it, listening to us adults talk, and the combination of interacting with the world and hearing us talk when we're interacting with the world tells them what these words actually mean. So that's how they bootstrap themselves. All of us bootstrap ourselves to intelligence. So I expect that's how it will really be done when human level intelligences actually exist. In the present AI models, you have these Chat GPT, for example. These have no connection whatsoever with physical reality. All they're using the supercomputing power to do is go over a huge base of human talking and human writing and try to figure out patterns. They have no idea, these machines, what these patterns actually mean. They can't because they've never interacted with the real world. Human beings have interacted with the real world. We all have. And that's how we learn what these words actually mean. Until computers are actually put in robotic bodies, so they can directly interact with the world like we do, we will not really see superhuman or even human level intelligence.
I would agree with that, even if a variant of the same argument seems to tell me that perhaps the base technology based on transformers and all that used in ChatGPT already can go a large way toward reproducing human intelligence. And the argument goes like this. I was involved in one of these discussions on self-driving cars recently. And the idea that comes to my mind is that, even if you don't program explicitly how to drive a car in a machine, but just expose the machine to a very big database of billions of hours of video of people driving their cars in a realistic city environment. I tend to believe that doing exactly the same kind of extrapolation that ChatGPT is doing with language, the machine would learn how to drive a car as well as I do. And this seems to suggest the idea that once artificial intelligences inhabit robotic, human-like robotic bodies, and are just let loose into the physical world, they should learn how the world works by just by themselves, by looking and finding all statistical regularity that they can find in the data, which again seems to suggest that perhaps we are not that far from human level artificial intelligence, because the technology we are using now already goes a good part of the way.
I'm not going to disagree with that, because an example I will give supporting your view is they let a laptop computer, let's go with the laptop power rather than these supercomputers, play Top Gun. Now, Top Gun in the United States is a training for aircraft fighter pilots. And a American Air Force or Navy officer will go into a simulator, and rather than playing around with the real jet to start with, he will then get in simulated combat. And the Air Forces in the United States make a huge effort to make these simulators as accurate as possible. Now, what they did was to hook a laptop computer and allow it to analyze all these recorded games made by professional, very good fighter pilots. What was interesting is that after a while, by analyzing only, not flying a real machine, it was able, when it was put up against a human in a simulator, to usually defeat the human Top Gun fighter pilot. And this is doing exactly what you just said. They can come close, but to really learn about the world, you still got to interact with it. This is where I come in as a physicist, because remember, to really learn what the physical world is like, you ultimately have to interact with it. You just can't play games in your own imagination, because no matter how smart you are, if you're not clobbered by reality on occasion, you will go off on weird tangents and generate all sorts of nonsense. That's why I emphasize the importance of interacting with the real world. Now, you can interact with the real world by comparing huge databases of human beings and them driving cars, for example, because what you're doing is you're interacting indirectly with the world through these human beings driving those cars, just like that computer program running on a simple laptop with the speed of a laptop and the memory of a laptop. This was something like 5 years ago. laptops today are even faster and have much more memory, it was still able, after looking at these patterns, to defeat a human fighter pilot. But to really go beyond that, you're going to have these programs interact with the real world. And going beyond that, becoming superhuman, they are definitely going to have to interact with the real world.
And so going back to the ultimate supercomputers of the future, which will steal the entire universe toward an intended end, those computers would not be anything similar to today's laptops, I guess. They would be made of fluctuating quantum gravitational field or something like that, I guess.
This is what I was proposing in physics of mortality. Basically, the computers will be made of excited states of various fields near the final singularity, which is, I give the name omega point to, because in the Penrose C-boundary construction, which basically gives you topologies on singularities, it turns out to be a point. Whereas the initial singularity, you can prove, is a three-sphere. In the Penrose C-boundary topology. That's why I call it the omega point theory. No event horizons. But the supercomputers, when they take over the universe, they won't stop evolving. They will continue evolving to higher and higher states. And what I've just described, and you've described, of the types of computers near the final state, they will be closer to the computers we have today in the near future. These computers that I've just described will be there only in the very end of the collapsing phase of universal history. We're still in the expanding and accelerating phase of universal history.
And of course, at that point, there is no difference to be made anymore between supercomputers of the future and intelligent people of the future.
Exactly.
In fact, you have this very beautiful last sentence in your organ interview when he asks something like whether people will find living in the omega point boring. You say that since the complexity of the universe diverges to infinity as the omega point is approached, we will have an infinite number of things to do. And therefore, we won't be bored. And this looks like really an ideal conception of a heaven when you can be happy forever and can always continue to grow, to me.
Well, what can I say? If the laws of physics be for us, who can be against us?
Right.
The laws of physics that, go ahead.
No, I don't claim to understand entirely your ideas in detail. What I have seen and what I can understand looks very persuasive to me, perhaps with one exception. And that exception would be that you said many times that the laws of physics that we can formulate at this moment, early 2025, early 21st century, are already good enough to have this discussion. I see why you say, well, from a very pragmatic point of view, since using today's laws of physics is all we can do, then we'd better do that. Huh? But in general, I find it very difficult to believe that at this very early stage in our evolutionary history, we are already very close to understanding much of the ultimate laws of physics. It's not that I have a specific objection to this, but I find it difficult to believe in the sense that the universe is still very young. We are still very young. And I find it difficult to believe that we already know all that we need to know to discuss these things. I would be interested in hearing your thought about that.
Okay, I think that's a reasonable objection. And let me tell you where I'm coming from, why I believe we essentially have it all, or close enough to all to really talk about the overall future of the universe to its very end. The first thing, if you were to go back to the middle of the 19th century and ask educated people, physicists in particular, do we know essentially all the laws of physics? And they would have universally answered, yes, Newton basically got them all. Now, what changed that view in the early part of the 20th century, of course, was the discovery of quantum mechanics and relativity theory. These are considered revolutions which refuted the claim of Newtonian mechanics. Now, this was in truth believed in the early part of the 20th century, but it turns out to be mathematically false. They did not realize that in the early 20th century because they did not know about the mathematics at the level we now do. What we can now say is there were no revolutions in 20th century physics, that in reality, quantum mechanics is just classical mechanics made mathematically consistent. Relativity is just classical physics made mathematically consistent. In other words, all they had to do was to take the physics of the middle of the 19th century and make these equations, which they all knew about, mutually mathematically consistent. If they did that, they didn't, but they could have, because as they had the necessary mathematics by 1900. I can't tell you exactly when they had the mathematics to do this, but certainly they could have done it by 1900. They didn't need any additional experiments, any additional observations to get relativity and quantum mechanics. So the point is that we're really still using classical mechanics, even though we now call it relativity and quantum mechanics. Now, I've argued in my papers that we now have an additional advance called the Standard Model of Particle Physics, which purports to be a theory of everything excluding gravity. All matter, all forces are included in the Standard Model of particle physics. The men and women who created this theory did not consider it revolutionary. They considered it just an application of standard techniques which had been developed to handle electromagnetism and relativity and quantum mechanics. I argue that if you continue on and quantize gravity in the obvious way, there are two obvious ways to quantize it. You can either quantize it using the approach of Feynman and Weinberg, that basically considers gravity just a spin to feel, quantize it in the usual way you quantize any spin. We knew how to do that by 1950, something like that. Then you get a quantum gravity theory, or you can do it, we think, an equivalent way. No one's rigorously proven this, but the general opinion is it's equivalent to Feynman-Weinberg. Do it the way DeWitt and Wheeler did. I use DeWitt-Wheeler generally in my quantum gravity calculations because it's easier to apply to the universe as a whole. To quantize universes is really easy in that mathematical language, so I use that. But the point is, when you combine these theories of quantum gravity with the Standard Model, you get a theory of everything. There's nothing left out. This is really the reason, these two reasons. First, here is a purported theory of everything, which we've got, and it leaves nothing out. There are no forces, nothing that we haven't seen that's not explained by these two theories. That plus the fact that there were really no revolutions in 20th century physics is what convinces me that we can trust these laws of physics all the way into the future. Now, let me give you a philosophical argument, really a physical argument, but I'll call it a philosophical argument for the moment. Maybe it was necessary for the very beginning of intelligent life to figure out these laws early in the universe's history in order for this expansion to actually be carried out most effectively. Then the laws of physics would be set up in such a way that it's really easy to figure out these ultimate laws. And that would explain why we figured them out very early in universal history, because the universe was set up so that we could.
I think I missed one point, and why was the universe set up so that we could? What was the advantage in us being able to understand these things quick?
Well, part of the reason I think that's true is because if you look at how the laws of physics are set up, you see they're, so to speak, nested, that you don't have to get the whole detailed picture all at once. You can just get a piece and build on that piece and then add to another piece. The laws of physics could have been set up. We can imagine such a universe in which you would have to get all of it in order to get any piece. But the universe is not set up that way. You can do a heck of a lot just knowing a very little. And it might be that this series terminates after just a few iterations. Why not? The evidence, as I've said, is that the theories which we now have, which really followed from the physics of the 19th century, if they just impose the condition of mathematical consistency, given what they knew, and given more powerful mathematics than they actually had at the middle of the 19th century, then you could get all modern physics. The fact is that you don't really need much to get all of this stuff. And as far as we can tell, given our observations, we've got it all. There isn't anything out there not explained. No observations. Now, they knew in the 19th century that there were plenty of things unexplained. For example, Darwin was asked, can you explain the origin of matter? The origin of life. And Darwin says, I have no idea how life got started. You might as well ask me about how did matter originate? What is the origin of matter? Now, all physicists knew that they had no explanation for how matter actually was created. We now know how it was done given the Standard Model. The Standard Model tells us how matter was created in the very early universe. So these things they knew in the 19th century, they did not know. We don't have any similar unknown things today. So that's why I'm reasonably confident, strongly confident, in fact, that we basically have enough physics to talk about the entire future of the universe and very early in the universe. Now, in the Horgan interview, I describe, we can't, of course, do an experiment on the ultimate future. That lies in the future. We can't get hold of the future, but we can do observations on the past. We do that all the time when we look out into the sky. If you observe a galaxy that's 1,000,000 light years away, what you're really doing is you're looking back in time 1,000,000 years. When we observe the background radiation, we are observing the universe at least 13.8 billion years, something like 500,000 years after the universe actually came into existence. So observing the background radiation gets us very close. Now, I'm arguing in the Horgan interview, it does better than 500,000 years. It gets us all the way back to zero. And I argue that the universe had to begin in a standard model field. It's called the SU2 left field. That's just a technical term. But it's one of the fundamental fields of nature according to the Standard Model, which again has been confirmed by all the experiments we've been able to do over the past 50 years. And people have really tried to refute the Standard Model. Why? Because if you do refute the Standard Model, it's an automatic Nobel Prize and a chair at Harvard. People would love to refute the Standard Model. They've tried, they haven't been able to do it. So I'm reasonably confident that the Standard Model is A-OK. But my point is that all of these mysteries of physics, some of the cosmological problems disappear by assuming that the only field in the beginning was an SU2 left field. Now, then I ask, suppose that the SU2 left field survived to the present day, then it should have certain properties. It would be mainly, the background radiation would be mainly an SU2 left field in that case. Now, I got money from the IT billionaire, Peter Thiel, to build an observational observatory to check the background radiation and see if indeed it was an SU2 left field. As it turns out, all the previous observatories to observe the background radiation were unintentionally designed in a way that would eliminate the SU2 left effect. So they could not see if it was an SU2 left field. But we intentionally redesigned the background radiation telescope so that it would not eliminate the signal of an SU2 left field if indeed it was. In the Horgan interview, I give some of the experimental evidence that shows, yay, the background radiation is indeed an SU2 left field. If that's the case, then our observations of the background radiation are taking us back not merely 500,000 years before the beginning, but all the way back into the beginning of time, when the universe was actually created, the very moment it was created.
A couple of years ago, at an event that I organized, you already gave some hints at the results of this new experiment. I understand that in the last couple of years, the experiment has continued and the results have been confirmed.
Well, the thing is that this is an important point I think you've just made, that you can't believe the results of anybody's experiment until somebody else does the experiment and gets the same result. That has not been done yet. And the reason it has not been done is because we have not yet published the results of the experiment, and we have not yet even described how to reproduce how to build the observatory. I have a paper coming out that gives an outline of that. It probably will be published sometime. It should be published sometime this year, and I've now convinced the other members of the team to publish what we've got. Now, we were waiting to do a crucial additional observation, and it's been several years, because to use this, we had to add something to the equipment, and it's very sensitive to wind. So you can make an observation using this additional piece of equipment only when there's essentially zero wind. And in order to use the instrument, you also have to have the air to be completely clear. Not only is there no wind, but no clouds, minimal water vapor, and so forth. You'll have an event like that on the East Coast maybe twice, 3 times a year. But when you add the condition of no wind, you'll be lucky to get an observing session once every 5 years. So we had waited, it was up to 4 years, and we still haven't had the perfect conditions. So we were still waiting till we had this true confirmatory experiment that checks everything, including my theory of why the earlier observatory failed to see this effect. But unfortunately, during the summer, someone broke into our observatory and stole the instrument.
Oh my God.
So we can't now do the confirmatory experiment. So we're just going to have to go with what we've got. That's life these days. I've never heard of an experiment being stopped.
Oh man, those who like conspiracy theory would really have a field day. This would, I can imagine the headlines: experimental equipment stolen to prevent the scientific confirmation of the existence of God, or something like that.
I love that headline, but I don't think, of course, it's true. because I think that just some random drug addict broke in and stole it and fenced the various pieces. Microwave electronics can be quite expensive.
Yeah.
I know because I had to pay when one of our instruments burned out. We'd already spent all the money we got from Peter Thiel, so I had to pay for the amplifier several $1,000s out of my own pocket. So this stuff is valuable equipment. I'm not surprised that someone would like to steal it and try to sell it. It is a moral no-no, but again, that's the way life is these days in the United States anyway. But in any case, we should be able to publish this stuff hopefully within next few months, put it online anyway, and that's good enough. Now, there are other pieces of information, other observations that indicate that the background radiation is an SU2 left field. A student and I were looking at the ultra-high energy cosmic rays. Now, it's been a mystery ever since the discovery of the background radiation, why the ultra-high energy cosmic rays actually are seen. They should not exist at all, according to the standard theory of what the background radiation actually is, namely electromagnetic field. Because you can prove that if it's made up of typical electromagnetic photons, then an ultra-energy cosmic ray, when it clobbers one, should lose all its, well, over time, lose its energy by pair creation. Once you get above an energy, clobbering a CBR background radiation photon with a sufficiently high energy proton, that will create pions. So that would cause the proton in the ultra high energy cosmic ray to lose energy. As I've said, the first person who pointed out this effect, a guy named Gleason, at Cornell, says he was amazed that ultra high energy cosmic rays existed. Now, we've seen all these things, and most recently, in the last year, they observed a ultra high cosmic energy particle coming from a void, an area where there were no stars, no galaxies, nothing they could see. So how on earth could this particle be coming from a void? The answer is, if I'm right, if it is an SU2 left field, then it can come from 100 times than the standard particle. So what is it coming in my theory? Well, the student and I were able to locate a active galaxy, a galaxy with a black hole core, which produces high energy particles, that is outside, beyond the void, between us. The void is between us and this active galaxy that could have easily produced this particle. So this is one piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence is that if I'm right that the SU2 left field, if the background radiation is mainly an SU2 left field, then an effect called the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect should be 1/2 of its intensity as expected by standard theory. Now, the Planck instrument and just the Planck background radiation observatory, and before that, the WMAP observatory, both saw the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect was too low by a factor of 2. So this is independent evidence, independent of my experiment, that this background radiation is an SU2 left field. And it takes us all the way into, if I'm right, and the evidence, experimental evidence, shows that I am, such as we have. I would like additional confirmation because I'm what I call a belt and suspenders man. I like tons of different directions of evidence supporting the view. If I'm right, let's suppose I am, then it gets all the way back to the singularity from which the universe began. It shows the singularity actually exists. And what is the singularity? It's a supernatural being who created the universe out of nothing and controls everything that is inside the universe. That you can prove it has that property using the laws of physics. Now, what is a traditional 3-letter word for such a being?
God.
Exactly. But The God word is a word which you cannot utter at universities. It's dangerous. So maybe we should believe that conspiracy theory.
Right. Yeah, in fact, this is one of the points that I want to get to. But before that, summarizing your starting point, you say that, well, not only we do know enough physics, but our grandparents in the 19th century already knew enough physics themselves.
They
Maybe the
couldn't
case.
get the standard model of particle physics. They
Right.
didn't. You need the additional observation for that.
Right, exactly. In fact, I had the impression that you were kind of contradicting yourself because you said some time ago that, well, in order to understand the universe, one has to go out and do experiments with the universe, observe, and one cannot reconstruct everything into his mind without new experimental evidence. And I have the impression that, starting with Planck's work in 1900, there were very specific observational phenomena that classical physics was not able to explain, at least not with that level of mathematical sophistication that they have at that time, which would, confirm the fact that new experimental data always create new breakthroughs and paradigm shifts in science. Now,
You want me to address that first?
yes, in 2 minutes. Now, it
Okay.
seems to me that, suppose, well, we do have beautiful mathematical models of preliminary mathematical models of quantum gravity at this moment. But suppose sometime in the future we find out how to go out there among the stars and doing high energy, really high energy physics experiments near a black hole itself, which would be new experiments done in previously inaccessible conditions. Now, I have the impression that whenever in the history of science we have been able to do new experiments which were much beyond the experiments that we could do before that time, we have always found things that current theoretical models were not able to explain, and that is what eventually keeps pushing science forward. So I would kind of expect the same thing to continue to happen.
You want me to address this now?
Yes.
Okay. Let's take a specific case. You mentioned Planck's constant, which Planck introduced in 1900. That is considered the starting point of modern physics and the end point of classical physics. But I showed in a paper in 2014, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the following was the case. If you look at what's called the Hamilton-Jacobi equation, the Hamilton-Jacobi equation was developed by Hamilton and Jacobi in the early part of the 19th century. By this time, latter part of the 19th century, it was completely understood by physicists. This is 50 years after it was first written down, and it really followed from what's called least action principles, which had been first developed, of all things, by Hieron of Alexandria in the 1st century AD. So the basic idea mathematically was already there. Now it's been in existence for 2,000 years, least action principle. What Hamilton did, and Jacobi corrected a little error he made, that's why it's called the Hamilton-Jacobi equation, was to generalize the least action principle to its greatest extent. It had been generalized over and over for centuries, but he did it to the ultimate equation. And he got the ultimate equation of classical mechanics. Now, here's the interesting thing. it is mathematically inconsistent. Now, this problem with equations being mathematically inconsistent was first made use of by Maxwell in his derivation of his Maxwell's equations. Are you familiar with how he derived his Maxwell's equations? He added a term. Do you remember
Yes.
that?
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
Okay. Now, the point was that what he could show was when he was approaching the equations which he had Ampere's law, and he had the conservation of electric charge. You can prove that Ampere's law contradicts the law of conservation of electric charge. He had another law, which we call Gauss's law, which gave him a hint of what he needed to add. He added a term given by that hint by Gauss's law to Ampere's law, and that made the system consistent because you could then prove that with that added term, Ampere's law implied the law of conservation of electric charge. So what you're doing is you're eliminating a logical contradiction in your equations by adding a term. Now, the Hamilton-Jacobi equation is, in its original form and in the textbooks today in classical mechanics, mathematically inconsistent. Now, you can correct that once you accept what Maxwell accepts. You have to, first of all, believe what the equations are telling you actually exist. What the equations of that Maxwell had, the equations of Ampere's law, and also he had Faraday's law, they tell him that electric and magnetic fields exist even in the absence of electric charges and magnets. Now, to us, that's obvious because we've been taught that, and physicists have understood that for over a century. But at the time Maxwell was looking at the Maxwell equations, that was not obvious to physicists. They thought that these electric and magnetic fields were just figments of imagination or things that were there to make calculations useful. What really existed were the electric charges and the magnets, or the current carrying wires. Same thing. It was real physical objects, not these magnetic and electric fields, which you can't see. You can't. They're invisible. The equations tell us they're invisible. They didn't believe in their existence. Now let's take that idea over to the Hamilton-Jacobi equation. What the Hamilton-Jacobi equation is a many-worlds theory of classical mechanics. It says, the Hamilton-Jacobi equation says, there are innumerable, well, uncountable infinity of parallel universes out there. And physicists just dismiss that off the top of their head. Obviously, these things don't exist. They're just the Hamilton-Jacobi equation is not a serious equation. It is just something that makes calculations easy. So we'll just not worry about its mathematical inconsistencies. But if you take it seriously that these many worlds exist, then you have a conservation of many worlds in the equations, in the logic of the equation.
Hold on, a conservation of what exactly?
It's called the equation of continuity. It's a conservation law for the worlds of classical mechanics. That's what it is. Now I don't want to go into too much mathematics here on the program. You can go to my Proceedings in Academy of Sciences paper if you want more details. But the point is that they would never, in the 19th century, they would never take what the equations were saying seriously. So they would never write down a conservation law. It's essentially the same, mathematically, it's the same conservation law as the conservation of electric charge law. Mathematically, they're the same equation. So it's that what you're doing is by taking the Hamilton-Jacobi equation seriously as a description of reality, that equation is there.
Could you give me a semi-intuitive explanation of why the Hamilton-Jacobi equation would be inconsistent without assuming many words?
Okay. Well, I'm just saying that it's not inconsistent without assuming many worlds. The inconsistency is there where you consider the many worlds exist or not. The inconsistency has nothing to do. The elimination of the inconsistency requires
Yes,
many.
yes.
But my point is the inconsistency of the Hamilton-Jacobi equation is there when you believe in the many worlds or not, because the Hamilton-Jacobi equation is derived under the assumption that the Hamilton-Jacobi wave is everywhere twice differentiable. That's an assumption in the action principle. You have to
Mm-hmm.
make that assumption to derive the equation. Now what you find is take an attractive body here. Now the wave is coming through. What does the wave describe? Well, the wave describes the classical trajectories. So here is one classical trajectory, but it describes all possible classical trajectories. So another one could come, this is an attractive body, say. So the other one, since this is attractive, will bend in the opposite direction. Up here, it bends in this direction. Down here, it bends this direction because this is an attractive body. Now, this is the consequence. Now, over here, however, these waves are coming here. They're going to clobber right here. Now, what this means, you're having a cusp singularity.
Mm-hmm.
The direction here is inconsistent with the direction there,
Yes.
which means it's no longer C1. It's no longer first differentiable, but the assumption used to derive the equation says it has to be not only first, but second differentiable. So this shows you the equation is inconsistent, and they knew that in the 19th century. They did not know how to eliminate the inconsistency. But it's the same sort of situation that Maxwell was facing. What you can prove, and I will not go into the details of how to do this, unless you want me to expand,
Yeah.
and I will. But the point is, you add a term.
I think I get the idea, and I will go and look.
Okay, good enough.
Look
The point
here,
is
right? Huh?
but I'm describing this because I want to show you how H bar,
Yes.
Planck's constant, actually arises. Because you have to add a term, and it has to have a universal constant, which describes the interaction of the various worlds of the multiverse. That's what it does, and it has to have dimensions of action. So you conclude there must exist a universal constant with units of action that has to be put in to eliminate this inconsistency in the classical Hamilton-Jacobi equation. When you can put that term in, the Hamilton-Jacobi equation um, is equivalent mathematically to the non-relativistic Schrödinger equation. So that's why you can derive quantum mechanics by requiring that classical mechanics be mathematically consistent. So it's already there in 19th century physics. They did not realize it. They had to be whopped over the head with experiments to make them realize that that constant H bar was there. But they didn't have to have the experiments. They just had to follow the logic of mathematical consistency. Here's the equation. Let's make it mathematically consistent. There's one natural way to do that. Similarly, there is one natural way to make Ampere's law consistent with the conservation of electric charge, also called the equation of continuity in electromagnetism. That's adding the displacement current, as it's called, which Maxwell did. Similarly, adding this term, sometimes called the quantum potential, is enough to make classical mechanics consistent. When you make it consistent, you get
Hold
quantum.
on. I guess this quantum potential is not the same thing that David Bohm called quantum
Oh, it is the
potential.
same.
It
What I
is.
did was take
It
David
is.
Bohm's mathematics and work it in reverse. So he took the Schrodinger equation as his starting point, and he derived the existence of the quantum potential. So David Bohm is my predecessor. He did most of the mathematical work. I just turned it around and pointed out once you take a many worlds point of view of the Hamilton-Jacobi equation, you see you don't have any choice but to add that term to make it mathematically consistent. But without David Bohm doing it first, I wouldn't have had the mathematics to be able to do this. I explained this, of course, giving David Bohm full credit in my article. But of course, limited time, so I can't give everybody credit on everything.
Yeah, it's really too bad that the time is limited, because I want to get to
We're
2
almost out of time.
points.
My goodness,
Yeah, I hope you can stay like 15 or 20 more minutes,
I can
because
give you 20 more minutes. Yes.
I'd like to get to 2 points. And let me introduce the first like this. Now, we have been discussing of conscious AI, and it seems to me and to many others that the very concept of consciousness must and can only come together with the concept of free will, which seems quite difficult to make sense of in the context of a deterministic theory of the world.
Deterministic?
So, deterministic theory of the world.
Okay.
So that I'm quite, or I was quite puzzled when I found out that on the one hand, you exposed many words, interpretation of quantum physics, which, if you think of the multiverse at large, is a fully deterministic theory of reality indeed, while on the other hand, you still, and I underline that word, still think that there is a meaningful sense in which we can be said to have free will. So can you explain that very puzzling thing to me?
Yes. Now, I have a whole chapter on free will and determinism in my book, The Physics of Christianity.
I
And
read it again yesterday.
Okay. And I was shocked to discover I should have read this. David Deutsch was there before me in his The Fabric of Reality. He basically got the correct free will theory then. Heck. But that shows you something about physics, namely that all a physicist can do, since he is describing real reality, which is independent of a physicist. All he can do is let discover the idea earlier. Eventually, the idea will be discovered by some other physicist. That's why you can often have, in this case, it was independent discovery. The way it works is that now I should correct you on one thing, and I'll recommend another book by David Deutsch, the Beginning of Infinity. Beautiful book. He makes the point in that book that people have been using, including he and I, the phrase the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, implying that there is another legitimate interpretation. He points out in his book that there is no other legitimate interpretation of quantum mechanics than many worlds. If you accept the basic principles of quantum mechanics, the reality has to be many worlds. In other words, given quantum mechanics is true, once we assume that, or classical mechanics in its most powerful form, Hamilton-Jacobi theory, you have to grant the existence of parallel universes. In particular, there have to exist an uncountable number of you and I's having this same identical conversation out there in reality. That's what quantum mechanics is telling us. Now, in my proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, I pointed out how this identity of the observers, human beings, across the worlds is really what gave physicists the misinterpretation that the wave function was a probability amplitude. It's not. It's a relative density of the universes in the multiverse amplitude. If you want to figure out exactly what that means, go to that paper that I just referred to. But Deutsch makes the correct point that if quantum mechanics is true, many worlds has to be true. So those other universes actually have to exist. So let's consider that in the context of what is meant by free will. Now, I could, walk off right now and stop the interview right now. I think I actually have the free will power to do precisely that. Now, you, of course, hope I won't, and I'm not, but I could. I think I could use my free will power to do that. And I think you grant that I have that free will power. What does that really mean to say I have that free will power?
Hold
Now,
on. Can I interrupt you one moment?
you may.
I would kind of question the fact that you can, because as you just said, at this very moment, there are uncountable versions of Frank Tipler which go out of the room and don't explain these things to me. And there are other uncountable versions of you who do explain these things to me. Now, the density of these different words in the multiverse is fixed by, the history of the universe, but also your temperament and things. I do think that is more probable in the sense that there are more words in which you do that you will continue to explain these things to me. But the percentage of these things is fixed, set in stone by how the universe works. So if in which sense do you still say that you have the free will of staying here or going out?
Well, let's remember that when I'm talking about me doing certain thing, I'm not referring to those other versions of myself out there. I'm referring to this me right here in this particular universe. Now, the important thing,
even if you are identical versions so far.
That's right. They're identical, but they're not the same as me. This is in quantum mechanics, this is called the notion of indistinguishability. That
Right.
if two systems in the same quantum state, they are identical. The technical term is indistinguishable. But what that means is that if you interchange the two, nothing has happened. Now, it's hard for people to get their minds around that. The best way I think about how to explain it is most people think of copies, these other copies of myself, is copies in the sense of a Xerox copy. Now, everybody knows that if you make a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy, every time you make the copy, you're going to lose precision. So after a while, after about 100 copies, you have no idea what it says. It's imperfect. But in indistinguishability, you have to think of a perfect copy. A perfect copy is something like making a backup of one of your documents. Now, you don't, if you've made a backup of one of your documents, you don't care if your computer goes down vis-a-vis that particular document, because there is no difference between the backup copy and the original copy. They're the same. They're identical. That's the way to think about this identity of beings out there. Now, here's the point. Since I'm thinking only about this particular person, even though it is determined the relative ratios of the Tiplers that shut down the discussion now and walk out, and the Tiplers who keep going on to the end, at least another 15 minutes, that's fixed, that ratio. But this particular me, what is determined whether I walk out in the next instant, it is impossible because of indistinguishability to say this particular me will actually do that. So although the determinism applies across the collection, it is undetermined what this individual me will do. It doesn't mean anything to say this particular me will do this. That's
and what
you get
and what exactly do you mean by this individual in this context?
Well, here I am. I'm feeling myself to be a single person.
But all the other Franks would say are saying exactly the same thing.
They will say exactly the same thing. They're not aware of me either. That's the essence of a classical object, which you and I are. That comes out from the mathematics. It's nice in my derivation of Schrodinger equation because it shows you exactly what a classical object is. Basically, mathematically, a classical object is one whose modulus of its wave function satisfies Laplace's equation. That's a precise way of defining a classical object. But one of the implications of that is that a classical object must be totally unaware of the other versions of itself.
Okay.
The consequence mathematically. So I'm totally unaware of these other Frank Tiplers, although I can prove, given quantum mechanics, they have to exist. So, taking the point of view of one, it makes no sense to say this particular one will walk out the door or this particular one will stay to the end of the interview. That's a form of indeterminism. That's the origin of the free will. The whole system is determined, but not an individual trajectory. It's complicated. You have to go through it and see if
it's difficult. It's difficult to put one's finger on it. In fact, I've been familiar with your argument for years, and I usually think along the same lines, but there is still something that eludes me. I think perhaps one of the important things to underline is the fact that you have used the term classical, and the sense I make of it is that the fate of this collection as a whole is determined by quantum mechanics and the laws of physics. But if we want to consider the collection as a collection of independent classical things, then the symmetry is broken, and there is no way to tell what one specific individual will do.
Well, it's really the consequence of symmetry is still there. It's you can't possibly be aware of these. If you're a classical object, you can't be aware of these other versions of yourself. The equations are telling you that. Again,
I understand. Well, actually, I don't, but I will continue to think.
Well, remember, it's taken me a long time to understand this too. This is really counterintuitive, the idea of other versions of ourselves out there. And the reason it's counterintuitive is the laws of physics tell us that it's counterintuitive. Because if it was intuitive, we would be talking to the other versions of ourselves, right? And we would never doubt their existence. But what the laws of physics say, a classical object is defined defined by, as I said, that mathematical condition. And one of the implications of that mathematical condition is you can't be aware of the other versions of yourself.
And the classical object is defined as something that has free will.
Every object has a wave function. That's quantum mechanics. Now, a wave function can be represented mathematically as two pieces. It's called its modulus and its phase. These are two mathematical functions. They define a wave function. Like a wave function is a complex valued function. A complex valued function really is two functions which are interrelated, by square root of -1. Now, there's another way to write it in terms of what's called its modulus and its phase. Now, the modulus wave function equals R e to the is divided by h bar, s being the action. So R is the modulus. Now, a classical object is one whose modulus satisfies Laplace's equation. Del squared R equals 0. Now, the reason that's a classical object is because that causes the quantum potential, which is the interaction between the worlds, to be equal to 0. That's why it's a classical object. And Planck's constant, in other words, for such an object has no role at all. Because remember, the quantum potential is what? Minus h bar, Laplace operator acting on R, quantity divided by R. That's the quantum potential. So if the modulus set R satisfies Laplace's equation, that quantum potential vanishes. So there is no quantum mechanics. That means if there's no quantum mechanics, you're classical.
Oh my. Now, since I'm afraid my 15 extra minutes are almost over, I'd like to go through one sentence that you write in the Physics of Immortality. As a matter of fact, I have more than one sentence, but I'm going to focus on one, which has very much to do with free will, but it seems to me as one of the things over which you have kind of changed your mind between the Physics of Immortality and the physics of Christianity, at least in the sense that now you would not formulate it exactly in the same way. The sentence is this.
The free will theory is, I think it's wrong in the free will theory which I express in Physics of Immortality. And the reason it's wrong was interesting, because when I wrote the Physics of Christianity, I did not accept the law of unitarity. That's
you mean when you wrote the Physics of Immortality?
Yes, that Hawking had persuaded me that unitarity could not be good. He persuaded most experts in relativity that this was true. Now, I went through his calculation that if a black hole were to evaporate to conclusion, it would violate unitarity. And I am convinced that calculation is correct, from which I inferred that unitarity could not be good. But that was an incorrect inference, because what I should have said was, wait a second, he's proven that if a black hole evaporate to conclusion, it would violate unitarity. But I should have said, unitarity is a fundamental law of quantum mechanics. It cannot be violated. The only way to have those two statements consistent, remember we're emphasizing mathematical consistency here, is to have, the only way they can be mutually consistent is for the universe to end before any black hole, we know they're out there, we've seen them, has a chance to evaporate. That establishes the existence of a final singularity, because that's the only way the universe can end. So in other words, I had the proof of the omega point theory right there, and I failed to get the correct free will theory. I failed to be able to prove the omega point theory. Why? Because I refuse to believe the laws of physics that are in the textbooks. I'm recommending to everyone else, don't make my mistake. Believe the laws of physics that are in the textbook. Can I end here?
Just 2 more minutes. Okay? So that sentence would be, the free decisions of the agents are an irreducible factor in the generation of the physical universe and its laws, not merely the reverse. For the free decisions of all the agents past, present and future collectively generate the totality of existence. Do you still agree with this sentence or not?
I'd have to think about that one. Because remember, I'm arguing that the singularities create the universe. Now, by creating the universe, they create the space-time upon which the laws of physics actually operate. How that works, it's interesting to see how that works in general relativity, because Hawking and Ellis devote an entire chapter of their important book, The Large-Scale Structure of Space-Time, to showing exactly how you can get the entire universe of space-time for a single time now slice. It's really interesting to see how that works. You can generalize that to get anything. And what I'm doing is I'm taking their argument, and rather than using a already existing space-time slice in space-time, I'm projecting it into the singularity to let the singularity get the laws of physics and generate the space-time too. So the thing is that collectively, the entire universe might be equivalent to the singularity if you formulate that in a certain way. I want to argue that the singularity is actually at a higher level than the universe. In its totality, I don't know if I can prove that, not yet anyway. But given the universe and just the part of the singularity that generates the multiverse, I would say they are equivalent, and therefore perhaps the observations of everything would be equivalent to the universe. Maybe. I don't know. I would have to think about that, because remember, that particular part of the book is in the free will section, which is based on the assumption that unitarity is violated, which I deny, because unitarity is a fundamental principle of quantum mechanics. So I'd have to think about that one.
And could you dedicate the last minute to elaborate on the concept that the singularity creates the physical universe in some sense?
Okay, well, the idea is this. I've already mentioned that the way you get the construction of time given space is that this is the essence of this chapter of Hawking and Ellis. You take an instant of time, what's called a space-like hypersurface, and the data on it. Then assume the laws of physics, and that will give you a unique space-time, which is consistent with that initial space-like slice and the initial data on it. Now, the thing is, in physics, we generally think of the laws of physics and the initial data as separate things altogether. The laws of physics are unique, like Laplace's equation, that's one equation, but you can have a huge number of different initial data sets corresponding to different solutions of Laplace's equation. But if you've got only one universe, one multiverse, this applies to the multiverse too, but let me just restrict the argument for sake of pictures to the universe. There's only one universe. So therefore, there can be only one initial data set. So applied to cosmology, the initial data is every bit as unique as the equations themselves. So the initial data has to be accepted as a law of physics itself. But the initial data is generated by projection by the singularity. So given that the laws of physics and the singularity are on the same ontological level, and we know the initial data is generated by the singularity, it's plausible that the laws of physics are also generated by the singularity. Another way of thinking about that is that if you have only one solution to an equation, there's no difference between the equation and the solution. So the solution, which is generated by the omega point, well, that's one of the singularities. There are three singularities out there, which are really one. That's a mathematical statement, which I've proven in another 2005 paper, and I stated in Physics of Christianity, show how in outline it works. Then the singularity is the ultimate source of both the laws of physics and the initial data. It's responsible for everything. In this sense, it creates the universe. Now, outside of the universe and the singularity, which creates it, there is nothing, no space-time, no matter, no nothing. So in this sense, the singularity creates the entire universe out of nothing. So this is why I can say that the singularity, it's supernatural because it's outside of nature. It's outside of any possible law of physics, as the great cosmologist Fred Hoyle noted. It's not subject to any laws of physics. It generates the laws of physics. So it's outside of space and time, outside of physics. This, by definition, is supernatural. So the singularity is a supernatural being who created the universe out of nothing and controls everything that happens inside the universe. And now I think we've run out of time.
And I wish to thank you very much for this really excellent explanation. I hope after some thought, I will understand your explanation better.
Okay, well, if you don't, maybe you found a hole in my argument. That would also be a wonderful thing, because then I could correct my mistake. Okay.
Thank you so very much, Frank.
My pleasure. Goodbye.